Tonight we're joined by retired Marine lawyer and candidate for Maryland's 6th Congressional District, Chris Burnett. Chris, welcome to the show. Love to have you here. I think people hear Marine lawyer, and I think they immediately picture a few good men. Now tell us what the reality is, and is that true at all? Did the movie nail it? Give us the reality of what a Marine lawyer does and whether or not that was a good depiction of reality.
Well, first, thanks for having me on, and that's a great first question. I think they did a pretty good job with the level of intensity and professionalism that you'll find anywhere in the Marine Corps. But across my 22 years, and I did several tours in a courtroom, I never saw anybody matching Jack Nicholson's performance in an actual courtroom in the Marine Corps. So they did a pretty good job of capturing some of the elements, but I can't take anything away from Jack Nicholson in that movie.
Yeah, no, it's hard to beat that. That's a classic. We love that one. I also think of course, Full Metal Jacket as well. Is that that's got to be a reality when it comes to like the basic training, right?
Yeah, I would say they did a pretty good job there. Again, capturing the intensity of becoming a Marine and earning that title, and then what it means to follow through on that commitment. So there's some good movies out there, and I think they do a good job of capturing the essence of what it means to become a Marine and then what it means to serve on active duty. So I've enjoyed them. I would say there's a little bit of an exaggeration here and there, but that's to be expected of Hollywood, right?
Yes. Well, there's little we actually expect of Hollywood, but we know that they
Sure.
take a lot of liberties with things. I think the important thing is that we're incredibly grateful for your service, for all of those who serve. And I appreciate that these movies, in some respect, depict the reality of the entirety of what it means to become, a member of our military, because it's not easy. You guys sacrifice a lot. There's so much that goes into training our incredible men and women in our United States military. So we're so grateful. Before you retired, you did war planning in the Middle East, and before that in South America for Venezuela. So what does that mean? What does that look like?
So across my career, I had spent quite a bit of time mostly learning and specializing in international operational law. And as a Marine Corps officer, you're first and foremost there to set the conditions for other people to succeed. And as a lawyer, all you're really doing is contributing as an officer in a planning process with a legal expertise. So you're a line officer first. So I spent quite a bit of time helping to shape our war plans, both in South America when I was at U.S. Southern Command, and then also across 5 deployments to the Middle East. We were constantly looking at the Iranian problem set of how did we respond to their proxies, how do we respond to direct threats, and how do we respond to their capability to hold us at risk in a region where we had a significant presence.
Yeah, so I'm so curious, now that you served in both of those roles and spent time in both Venezuela and focused obviously on Iran, which I think for a long time a lot of people did, what has it been like to see all of the recent movement in both Venezuela, of course, first with Maduro and everything that transpired there, and now in Iran? I mean, there was so much talk before, Chris, but rarely any action until this president, President Donald Trump, got back in office. And like so many things, people said they would do something about it. He actually got the job done. What's it been like?
Well, first, it was night and day. I've deployed across several different presidents, and I can tell you whenever President Trump was in office, it allowed the military to do what the military does best, and that is to focus on mission accomplishment and to actually get things done. And so across his first time in office, it was a completely different experience in terms of access to authorities and the ability to execute. And why that matters is that oftentimes we'll have leadership, whether it's SecDef or a president, that will basically restrict the ability of the military to plan to mission success. And when you can't plan to mission success, you're going to absorb risk. And that's where you have service members put at risk unnecessarily for people trying to score political points. And with President Trump, we never encountered ever any assumption of risk other than what was absolutely necessary to comply with the law of armed conflict and to ensure that we were doing things in accordance with U.S. law. So it's been my experience was night and day. Whenever he was in office, we got a tremendous amount done. Now, in particular, whenever you look at Venezuela and Iran, I think you could say that we had kicked the can down the road on both of those areas and simply failed to recognize that we either had an emerging threat or that we had a deteriorating relationship. For Venezuela, I mean, we had lost essentially influence over our own hemisphere, given that you had an influx of Chinese and Russian influence in a country that was failing. There was human rights problems within the country. You had drug problems, you had corruption, and then you also had really unfettered access by China and Russia, bringing in warships and war capability. My war planning assistance in that regard dealt primarily with if we had to conduct an evacuation, which was identifying military and dual-use targets, and oftentimes that was Russian or Chinese technology. With Iran, there was a similar problem. We would transit the Strait of Hormuz, and we were required to assume a level of risk that we would not assume anywhere else in the world. And we were told that it was because of Iranian saber rattling and that our fear of provocation or escalation. Well, the way in the military you look at that is we don't absorb that risk. We shouldn't be the ones in fear of escalation. Other countries that are trying to invade our space or invade our ability to operate should be the ones that are concerned about an uncontrolled escalation. So to finally see that we're taking action that was needed, not only for U.S. national security interests, but also global economic interests, was long overdue. And this is a breath of fresh air.
Yeah, it's amazing when you go back to the president's first term in office. And I continue to think about this. Obviously, watching all this play out, I think is very exciting. And I remember, Chris, before he even became president, my father-in-law telling all of us in our family, listen, I want to do the right thing. And whether that means I get one term only in office or maybe two, it doesn't matter, because I want to do the right thing in a whole host of different spaces. And I think back to first term in office, whenever you heard the president talk about, and you kind of alluded to it, the fact that previously there was very little that the military felt like it was able to get done, because they would always have to, the commanders out in the field would have to call the president of the United States to get a go-ahead on certain things. For example, taking out and eradicating ISIS. And I remember my father-in-law telling this story about how he went to one of the top brass in the military and he said, listen, what is it that we need to do to get rid of ISIS? And how long do you think it'll take? And he said, oh, sir, I don't know. It could take many, many years, but it's because we have to we have to call the president, and no matter what hour it is, to get the go-ahead. And by the time it gets back and the game of telephone is played, maybe our window is closed in terms of, getting the bad guys. So he said, all right, listen, you don't have to call me. You guys are the experts. I want you to handle it. And ISIS was dealt with, Chris, in a matter of weeks. That has got to be, as a member of the military, as some of these commanders who have had so much experience and kind of like you, been able to serve under so many different presidents, man, what a difference it makes whenever you have a leader who says, I'm not the expert here, you're the expert here, you guys take charge. And it sounds like that's exactly what you experienced in a lot of fronts as well.
Yeah, and I think what we're seeing is this is what actual leadership looks like. That is, you assume the responsibility for other people to effectuate an outcome. And in this case, President Trump has said, I'm going to lead on this. And by leading, I'm going to give the individuals that need the authority to act, to act. I was on both ends of the ISIS conflict. So in 2016, I was deployed on the 13th MU, and we found ourselves in the Middle East supporting combat operations that were counter-ISIS. And then what we saw over the course of that deployment, and this is the very tail end of the Obama administration, is we were essentially handcuffed. There were diplomatic concerns, there were optics, there were all of these things other than military objectives that were driving the authorities and the approval of those authorities to act. And then as I continued over the course of the next several years, we saw a significant shift in how President Trump delegated authorities, looked at military objectives, and allowed commanders to execute on those objectives. So then my last deployment, which was my 5th deployment to the Middle East, was for CJTF OIR. That was the counter-ISIS mission. That was 2020 to 2021. And once again, we saw this almost unfettered access to authorities that allowed commanders to make decisions about mitigating risk involving U.S. forces, involving civilians in the area, but ultimately being able to get after the objective, and that was eliminating ISIS as a threat. Now, what was fascinating about that last deployment, at the very beginning of that deployment, we were still focused on ISIS. Towards the end of that deployment, we were almost entirely focused on Iranian proxies operating in Iraq. And those Iranian proxies were putting U.S. personnel and U.S. interests at risk, and oftentimes causing injuries and hurting U.S. service members through either IEDs, training, or equipping local militia that were attacking U.S. forces in the region. So to finally see us taking action against Iran after nearly 4 decades of them holding us at risk, humiliating the U.S. military, requiring us to transit the Strait of Hormuz on their terms, and then to know that they were attacking U.S. personnel and interfering with U.S. operations, this was so long overdue, and this is being done the right way. And I appreciate the fact that he's willing to accept the political blowback of what is going to secure peace for the years to come.
Yeah, thank God. That's all. I think all the time, thank God. And I will forever believe that Donald Trump was meant to be president for this moment, in this time. There's a reason that 2020 worked out the way it did, despite the fact that we all worked, Chris, very hard during that election, and there's a lot of question about what happened there. I still believe that God wanted Donald Trump in the White House for right now to do the right things on, again, in a whole host of different spaces. Just to get back to Iran and Venezuela, look, the U.S. media coverage we know is slanted significantly to the left. They are basically the marketing arm of the Democrat Party at this point, the liberal legacy mainstream media, right? So whenever you have a situation like Maduro's capture to be brought back to U.S. soil to face justice here for the crimes that he committed against Americans, or you look at what's going on in Iran, again, long overdue. They were developing a nuclear weapon. They were funding, the number one funder of terrorism around the world. And you finally have somebody taking action on both of those fronts. But the way it's portrayed oftentimes to people here in the U.S. is very different than the reality. So maybe you have some insight during your time kind of in both spaces. What do you think the average person may not understand that's going on in Iran or has gone on in Iran or in Venezuela that they would be shocked to learn about?
Well, I don't think people realize just how precarious peace is. And that the United States military every single day is deterring threats, whether it's in a cyberspace capacity, whether it's physical threats to U.S. interests overseas, or its hemispheric influence. And I don't think people realize just how difficult it is to maintain that level of peace and prosperity that we've just come to expect. And so whenever you have rogue countries like Iran and you have countries like Venezuela that are now using the global order and the rules-based system that you've heard a lot of people talk about against us, well, we now have to then take steps to reassert ourselves to ensure that not only are we protecting U.S. interests, but we're stabilizing that world order that we've come to take for granted. And I don't know that the average news consumer is aware of how politicized the messaging has become. And you'll hear people make these empty statements that are quite frankly either ill-informed or just wrong and trying to score political points. I'm amazed at the number of folks, and I can't help but think that they're either willfully ignorant or they just simply haven't read the Constitution. They don't understand executive authority. They don't understand the commander-in-chief. They don't understand the War Powers Resolution. So they'll make these empty statements about whether they think something is a legal action or not. They won't challenge it in court. They won't take any actual steps against it. They'll just make a statement that'll do the rounds on the news, and somehow that's the headline. It has nothing to do with the actual U.S. law, international law, or the scope of authority that we're operating under, but yet that becomes the story. And I really question the motive of many of the media outlets as to, are they simply trying to make this as negative as possible so that they can get clickbait or attention, sell advertising, really at the expense of what we're doing with our national security and foreign policy? The level of risk that U.S. personnel face every single day in the Middle East because Iran as a rogue state has existed was unacceptable. And the fact that we kicked the can and that we accepted that level of risk over the years is unfortunate. And it's unfortunate that it took President Trump to finally take action that was needed to resolve what had been a long-standing problem in the Middle East, not only rising the cost of operating in the region, but the global economy has suffered because they keep the entire region at risk. So this is overdue. I couldn't be more proud of what U.S. service members have done in Venezuela, what they're doing in Iran. And I know that though this is always a difficult path to take, this is going to set the conditions for peace and prosperity and is going to stabilize the region for decades to come.
I mean, that's the goal. And to bring up the fact that you're right, I feel like for so many of us out there, you turn on certain media outlets and you're like, are these people just wholly against our country? Are they rooting against America? And quite frankly, Chris, I've been shocked. We know it typically comes from the left. There have been a lot of folks on the right as well who have been a little crazy when it comes to Iran. Look, this is a president who solved 8 conflicts around the world in his first year in office. He wants to be known as the president of peace, but he's also going to do the right thing when it comes to the American people, when it comes to, as you said, stabilizing the world, because what are we going to have if Iran gains a nuclear weapon, if they're able to develop that, and then they hold the whole world hostage? We can't do that. And so this president has said, I want to do the right thing, despite the fact that I know I'm going to be, accused of being a bad person by some or doing the wrong thing. You're never going to please everybody. But you're right. I think this, for the long term, safety of our country and safety of the world, was a necessity. Now, there's something that also has come out of all of this when we're talking about Venezuela, especially Cuba, has been top of mind, certainly for the president. You've heard him talk a lot about it. What do you make of all the talk, about Cuba recently based on the experience you have?
Cuba has been a thorn in our side for decades. And I think for a majority of that time, they've been propped up by Russia and they've been propped up by Venezuela. And now that we've cut off some of the support that they've received, I think we're starting to see that the paper tiger that was Cuba and that had been oppressing its people for decades is going to fall. I do not believe military action is going to be required. I think what we're seeing is the inevitable collapse of a broken regime. And my hope is for the Cuban people that they finally get to experience the freedom that they've been craving. The folks that I had met when I was at U.S. Southern Command that had fled Cuba and had made a great life for themselves in southern Florida had dreamed of the day of going back to Cuba to make it the great country that it can be. So what I sense right now is it's in the media, it's in sort of our collective discourse, because there's an interest in resolving yet another hemispheric threat that we've had to endure for political reasons. We just haven't had the will to do what was needed, which was to assist the Cuban people in overthrowing a regime that has been incredibly oppressive and that has really forced them to suffer through an existence that wasn't needed. And ideally, that with Venezuela out of the picture and with Iran out of the picture and now with Russia struggling with keeping up with even the bare minimum ability to sustain operations in Ukraine and elsewhere, I think Cuba is isolated, and I think the Cuban people are going to speak out against the regime that has really just been devastating to them.
Yeah, listen, it's really interesting to me always to talk to Cuban Americans, because they are some of the biggest supporters of President Trump you'll find out there. And why is that? It's because their families, and in some instances they themselves, lived through what has gone on in Cuba for far too long. I think it's shocking, quite frankly, that Cuba has been able to maintain this control over their people, this dictatorship of sorts over the people of Cuba for as long as they have, because they can't have been stable to any extent. But you're right, they were aided by bigger countries, by more powerful countries, and they've been able to prop themselves up for a long time. But you find that those are the people who love President Trump. They love freedom. They love America because they've seen the other side of it. They've seen what communism will do to a country, and they're terrified that it ultimately comes here. And then it's shocking to me, Chris, because you have these liberal groups like Code Pink who are taking trips to Cuba to oppose President Trump in whatever way they can. They really don't care what it is. They're going to be against him no matter what. So in this instance, I guess they're going to support the communist regime in Cuba. What is that disconnect between liberals in America and, these Cuban people who have been screaming for freedom? They want to be free of this dictatorship and this oppression. They've been screaming for decades to get free of it. How is it that these liberals in the United States have no idea the true history here?
Whenever I try to understand some of these positions, I quite literally take the opposite of common sense. So I start
Yes.
with, okay, what would make sense, what would most people accept as right, as objectively true, objectively good, and what is the opposite of that? And that's usually where I find myself now starting to understand how they can position themselves in support of Cuba, in support of Maduro, in support of an Iranian regime that has been perhaps the most violent and oppressive regime of modern history. And outside of just their sheer hatred of President Trump or their misunderstanding of what the American dream is and what American values are, I don't know how else you can reconcile their position, their behavior, and their point of view, other than to say they're simply in opposition of everything that would otherwise make sense for the good or betterment of people.
Yeah, it is mind-boggling. You're right. If you want to get in the head of a liberal, a lot of times you just have to say, all right, I'm going to take a step back and do the opposite of any sort of commonsensical type thing. Because it's crazy. If you learned any sort of basic history of the world, you understand why Cuba ended up the way it is. Why you literally, if you visit Cuba, they're in the 1950s in terms of their infrastructure, their automobiles, all of it, because it's terrible for countries. It destroyed the country of Cuba. It's crazy. But here we are. They can't help themselves. We know that. Before we let you go, we really want to hear from you about your run for Congress. Why is it that you decided to retire from the military? Why is it you want to be part of the United States Congress? God knows we do need to talk about a few good men. We need a few good men and women to be members of Congress, because there's a lot of crazy going on there as well. So tell us why you decided to jump into all this.
Well, as I came off active duty, it was clear that my wife did not want to move anymore, and she wanted to stabilize our household for the kids so they could finish high school and they could go to a single school for the first time in almost, at that point, 22 years of just moving around constantly. So we wanted to stabilize the house, take care of the kids. And what we started looking at was what we were going to do next. And when my wife was unable to open a business, and she's a naturalized U.S. citizen, she came from West Africa and Guinea. And so the American dream for her was to pursue this opportunity to start a business. And when she realized that in Maryland, where she wanted us to stay, that she couldn't open a business, I was able to convince her that this might be the best way for me to continue my service to our country, was to run for Congress. And then as I investigated further, I live in Congressional District 6. And our current Congresswoman, Delaney, is a multimillionaire who lives outside of the district. Her husband had previously been the congressman for Congressional District 6. And she had taken over the position from David Trone, an out-of-district billionaire. And what it was clear is that Congressional District 6 had not had a conservative voice since Roscoe Bartlett, when he was gerrymandered out in 2012. So I saw an opportunity to fulfill a promise that I'd made to my wife and to really bring a voice back to Congressional District 6 of families like mine that are struggling with the affordability crisis in Maryland. And I mentioned the affordability crisis in Maryland because we have a supermajority that has absolutely devastated the middle class. And they've done so intentionally. They've regulated businesses out of existence. They're overtaxing residents. They've put fees on everything under the sun, and none of the services have improved. The quality of life for your average Marylander has gotten worse as we're paying more to a state that is just dysfunctional. So when I saw an opportunity to lead, and I saw an opportunity to continue my service to this country, running for Congress made the most sense. So what we're now doing is we're running a grassroots campaign from the ground up to send either Delaney or Trone back to their homes out of the district and bring a voice back to Western Maryland. And it's been a phenomenal response that folks have had, because they like the idea of somebody in the district who represents their values, represents their interests, and is having the same experience that they're having with the affordability crisis to be a voice in Congress for their interests. So it's been a great experience already, and we're just starting to get ready for a summer sprint to make Western Maryland red again.
I got to tell you, it's great to hear you say that. What a shocker that people may want someone who actually lives in the district to represent them in Congress. It's a novel idea, I know, to a lot of these people. The gerrymandering in Maryland has been outrageous. It's been one of the craziest things to watch over the course of several years. So good for you. We wish you the best of luck. Where can people find out maybe how to get involved in your campaign, more about you, how to volunteer, etc.?
So BurnettForCongress.com is my website. From there, you can check everything that we've put on social media. We've posted over 200 videos of all the places that we've been for town halls, all of the events we've conducted. Everything that we do, we post. We're trying to have as transparent of a campaign as possible. But you can go onto the website to sign up to volunteer, sign up for our newsletter, and also donate to our campaign. We're beginning a general election messaging campaign that's going to really try to touch individual homes to get people out and to finally make Western Maryland red again. But it's going to require a tremendous amount of effort to unseat 2 out-of-district billionaires competing for an opportunity to play national politics at our expense.
Well, Chris, we're wishing you the best of luck. Thank you again for your service to our country. We're incredibly grateful for all who serve, and I'm so grateful that you spent some time with us today. Good luck with your race, and we hope you'll come back and update us very soon.
Thank you. I hope to see you again soon.